Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.43 40 Years of Trouble. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I described how Solomon's kingdom was sundered in two. Now Jeroboam was king of Israel, and Solomon's son Rehoboam was king of Judah. We don't really know how old Rehoboam was upon his coronation. The Masoretic text says he was 41. The Septuagint says he was 16. Rehoboam comes across as the typical son of a dictator. Megalomaniacal, jealous, incompetent, and surrounded by yes-men. His actions would better fit a born-to-rule 16-year-old than a mature prince of the line. Kings is clear that Rehoboam lost the kingdom because of his father Solomon's apostasy. Rehoboam never attempted to recover Israel. The best he could manage were border raids. There were many skirmishes between the two kingdoms in the first decades, the tiny tribe of Benjamin suffering the brunt of the fighting. Kings offers little about his reign, save for his ineptitude in the Israelite succession and the story of an invasion by the Egyptians under Pharaoh Sheshonk. The pharaoh is also called Shishak or Sheshok or Shoshenk. Pick your pronunciation. The invasion is conventionally dated to 926 BC. The chronicler has more to say than Kings. He wants to present Solomon in the best possible light, so he omits all that foreign wife stuff leading to disaster. He's also more inclined to paint Solomon's first successors with a rosy hue. Chronicles expands on Rehoboam, to whom he attributes 18 wives and 60 concubines. It's good to be king. He hints that Rehoboam was insecure on the throne. Chronicles reports that he constructed 15 cities of defence and sent his sons throughout the kingdom. Now, these cities were not on his borders, but scattered through the southern hill country. This implies that he was concerned to shore up support throughout the kingdom. Chronicles explains that Rehoboam was directed by the prophet Shemaiah to neither invade Israel nor oppose the Egyptians. Chronicles divides Rehoboam's reign into two portions: 3 years of fidelity to God and 13 of insubordination. The invasion of Sheshonk is placed in the period of disobedience. The Egyptian campaign is presented as punishment for the king's immaturity. Where Kings blames Rehoboam's misfortunes on Solomon's failures, the chronicler blames Rehoboam's youth. Pharaoh Sheshonk's invasion was the great calamity of Rehoboam's reign. Of course, according to Kings, it's all Judah's fault. Quote, 1 Kings 14:22. Judah did what was displeasing to Yahweh, and angered him more than their fathers had done, by the sins that they committed. They too built for themselves shrines, pillars, and sacred posts on every high hill and under every leafy tree. There were also male prostitutes in the land. Judah imitated all the abhorrent practices of the nations that Yahweh had dispossessed before the Israelites. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, King Shishak of Egypt marched against Jerusalem and carried off the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the royal palace. He carried off everything. He even carried off all the golden shields that Solomon had made. End quote. Sheshonk was the first pharaoh of Egypt to build on a grand scale since the Bronze Age collapse, 300 years before. He was the first king for many years to take an Egyptian army abroad. Sheshonq erected a great colonnaded forecourt to the temple of Amun in Karnak. On one gate is the Bubastite portal. Here the great king lists dozens of Levantine cities that he captured and burnt. The pharaoh made good progress through the land, taking cities large and small. Archaeologists still find the dark bands of the ashes of Sheshonq's sackings in their excavations, showing that this fearsome list of conquests is a real report of events and not a rehashed recital of more ancient victories. For the first time, we have detailed evidence from Egypt about the geography and politics of the Hebrews. And for the first time, we have an event mentioned in both the Bible and in other sources. You would think that historians would welcome so much information. But the Bubastite portal raises more questions than it answers. I was originally going to say that Egyptologists are quite confident in dating Sheshonq's reign to 945 to 925 BC, give or take a year. Silly me. Some scholars now give or take 10 years on those dates. That would place Sheshonq's invasion anywhere between 955 to 915 BC. That's not quite the pinpoint precision we were hoping for. Jerusalem is the only city that the Bible says suffered the Pharaoh's depredations. Yet Jerusalem appears nowhere on Sheshonq's inscription. Is that because Rehoboam bought him off with all the temple treasure that his father had amassed? Contrary to the biblical account, Sheshonq's inscription implies that northern Israel, not Judah, bore the brunt of the attack. The biblical text indicates that Jeroboam of Israel was an ally of Egypt, and formerly a refugee there. So why was the Egyptian king now attacking his ally? And why are neither Rehoboam nor Jeroboam nor their kingdoms mentioned on the Bubastite portal? From the way Sheshonq describes it, you would think that the Levant was a land of independent city-states, not one of national kingdoms. I'll come back to all this very soon. After an incompetent reign of 16 years, Rehoboam was succeeded by his son Abijam, or Abijah, of Iyah. He reigned for only 3 years, dying in 907 BC. Kings has nothing to say about him, save that he was a no-good. Chronicles throws in a major victory over the king of Israel, and the fact that he had 14 wives and 38 children. It's still good to be king. Abijah's short reign, and the very long reign assigned to his son Asa, suggests that Abijah died an early death. Perhaps Asa was a minor when he became king, and his mother, Abijah's wife, served as regent during his minority. Now, who was Abijah's wife? Sometimes she is called Makar, daughter of Abishalom, who is perhaps Absalom, David's son. That would make Abijah and Makar both descendants of David. A nice, neat dynastic package, typical in the Bible. There is another Makar, who is described not as Abijah's wife, but Abijah's mother. One path out of this confusion is that Abijah and Asa were not father and son, but brothers. Let's leave Judah in 907 BC with the death of Abijah and return to Israel, run by that rebel Jeroboam. Jeroboam of Israel would outlive both his rival Rehoboam and Rehoboam's son Abijah. The reign of Jeroboam is unique in the historical narrative of the two kingdoms. The Septuagint has a substantially different narrative to that of the Masoretic text. It reworks the order of events, changes the prophet involved, and even gives Jeroboam an Egyptian wife. Jeroboam established his government at Shechem, now Nablus, in the tribe of Manasseh, about 50 kilometres north of Jerusalem. Shechem was hallowed in early Hebrew tradition. It was the location of the first altar to God, made by Abraham. Joseph was buried there. Joshua assembled the Israelites in Shechem and commanded them to reaffirm their adherence to the Torah. The Bible hints that he soon moved the capital to the town of Tirzah, another 20 kilometres northwards. Tirzah would serve as Israel's capital for 40 or 50 years, until the time of King Omri. Tirzah was a much better choice. It sat on a rich spring, in a fertile valley, in a strategic location on the road to the Jordan Valley and the Hebrew lands across the river. Still, Tirzah was a dinky little place. No one ever built a great palace or temple there. No one bothered to build a wall to protect it. Even Saul's capital at Gibeon had walls. No civil servant ever put stylus to clay or pen to papyrus. The kingdom was illiterate. To the horror of the author of Kings, Jeroboam founds his own religion. Quote, 1 Kings 12:26. Then Jeroboam said to himself, Now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem, the heart of this people will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah, and they will kill me. So the king made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one at Bethel, and before the other as far as Dan. He also made houses on high places, and appointed priests from among all the people who were not Levites. End quote. Jeroboam's golden calves were placed at the northernmost and southernmost boundaries of his kingdom. There's actually no archaeological evidence that the city of Dan in the north was even occupied at this time, let alone controlled by Jeroboam. But we'll let that slide. The Bible wants us to associate these calves with the golden calf of Aaron, and to regard Jeroboam as a great apostate. Yet God does not rage against these calves, as he did against Aaron's. In Exodus, God retaliated rapidly and ferociously. Utter a stray oath, light the wrong incense, touch the wrong relic, you're dead. No misdemeanour is overlooked, and there are no second chances. But here we have a king of Israel fabricating 2 golden calves without so much as a divine raised eyebrow. God does nothing. We can reach a much more sympathetic interpretation of Jeroboam's actions. Calves were common icons of the great god El, as common as the human lion-eagle cherubim that supported Yahweh's throne in the tabernacle and the temple. It is entirely possible that Jeroboam was not an apostate, but a conservative, trying to restore the old traditions. Let's go back to the patriarchs. The city of Jerusalem in Judah had no association with the patriarchs, save for the brief and enigmatic interaction between Abram and Jerusalem's king Melchizedek. Bethel certainly had a pedigree. After being commissioned by God, Abram's very first religious act was to build an altar there. Jacob had his first encounter with God at Bethel, and he also built an altar there. Now consider those new priests that Jeroboam installed in place of the Levites. Solomon had transferred the high priesthood from the house of Abiathar to the house of Zadok as a reward for Zadok's support upon his accession. I speculated in episode 1.34 that the Zadokite priests were native to Jerusalem and had nothing to do with the ancient lineage of Aaron. Jeroboam may have been trying to restore the Aaronite priesthood against the parvenus elevated by the house of David. It is easy to interpret Jeroboam as restoring the old faith in the God of the patriarchs and the God of the Exodus, and as discarding the new faith of David, centred on Jerusalem and its temple built by Gentiles. Kings wraps up its account with a surprise cameo appearance by the very man who prophesied Jeroboam's success, the prophet Ahijah. He brings no good news. Quote, 1 Kings 14:9. You have acted worse than all those who preceded you. Therefore I will bring disaster upon the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam he who pisses against the wall, even those fettered and forsaken in Israel. I will sweep away the house of Jeroboam utterly, as a ball of dung is burned until it is gone. The Lord will strike Israel until it sways like a reed in water. He will uproot Israel from this good land that he gave to their fathers, and will scatter them beyond the Euphrates. He will forsake Israel because of the sins that Jeroboam committed and led Israel to commit. End quote. The story I've just given you is the narrative recounted in 1 Kings, a history that describes a united kingdom torn asunder. As I discussed in episode 1.41, one school of scholars holds that this is a fantasy. There never was a united kingdom. Their take is that the two kingdoms had little in common, save a language and a god or two. Israel and Jeroboam had nothing to do with Judah and the house of David. But if the northern kingdom of Israel had nothing to do with Judah, from whence did it spring? There are a lot of explanations for that. I'll just give you one. It's pretty left field, but not completely crazy. Not completely. However, it does throw out the Bible's entire account of the united monarchy. According to this idea, Jeroboam was a typical chieftain of the northern highlands, in the manner of Saul a century before, and Labiu 3 centuries before that. If you are interested, I told Labiu's story back in episode 1.4. Saul's heartland was the towns of Bethel and Gibeon. Jeroboam was established further north at Shechem and Tazar, the ancient territory of the long-gone Labiu. None of these people had anything to do with the rustics south of Jerusalem. The northern highlands had its own political dynamic, throwing up petty strongmen through the centuries. While the Bible describes David as Saul's successor, it is possible that Saul's northern chiefdom coexisted with David's southern chieftain for decades, right through the reigns of both David and Solomon. Conventional dating puts Saul's death at about 1005 BC. What if his kingdom had survived for another 50 or 60 years after that? What if it was still around when Sheshonk moved into the Levant? In this theory, Saul's successors overreached themselves by threatening Egyptian interests in Canaan. A resurgent Egypt, led by Sheshonk, destroyed the chieftain of the house of Saul sometime after 950 BC. Sheshonk ignored Judah because there was no Judah to ignore. With the chieftain at Bethel Gibeon smashed, the Egyptians permitted their new friend Jeroboam to establish a new state further north, at Shechem Tazar. Yes, the theory is half crazy, but it explains a few puzzles. It explains why the Bible describes Egypt as a friend of Jeroboam. It explains why the Bible tells us that a king of Bethel Gibeon, Saul, died at Mount Gilboa, far to the north of his territory, fighting Philistines who lived south of his realm. He was not killed by Philistines, but by Sheshonk's army, perhaps filled with Philistine mercenaries. It explains why Sheshonk's inscription does not mention either a southern or a northern kingdom, or their leaders, or their capitals. They did not exist. I report, you deride. Jeroboam of Israel was succeeded by his son Nadab. He reigned for a year or two. While sieging a Philistine city in 904 BC, Nadab was assassinated by Baasha of the tribe of Issachar. Killing your own king and commander-in-chief in the middle of a war takes guts. Baasha must have been supported by the army. Why was Nadab attacking a Philistine city in the first place? Israel does not share a border with Philistia. The Philistines were Judah's problem, not Israel's. Perhaps Nadab was trying to encircle Judah. Perhaps General Baasha thought that was a bad strategy, one worth terminating, along with its originator. The Book of Kings gloats that the rebellious house of Jeroboam, that had dared to oppose the house of David, was extinguished so ingloriously in its second generation. Quote, 1 Kings 15:28. So Baasha killed Nadab in the 3rd year of King Asa of Judah and succeeded him. As soon as he was king, he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He left to the house of Jeroboam not one that breathed, until he had destroyed it, according to the word of Yahweh that he spoke, because of the sins of Jeroboam, that he committed and that he caused Israel to commit, and because of the anger to which he provoked Yahweh, the God of Israel. End quote. Baasha of Israel would reign for a healthy 2 decades, until 882 BC. According to the Bible, he feuded with King Asa of Judah all his days. Asa ascended the throne in 906 BC, a few years before Baasha. The biblical account says that he ruled for 40 years, but it is more likely that he died in 878 BC, after a reign of 32 years. As were all the Judean kings, Asa was of the line of David. Asa is one of the few kings after Solomon described as doing what was right in the sight of Yahweh. Kings approvingly records that Asa removed the idols of his father and the male prostitutes from the temple. I would love to know more about those male prostitutes. But Asa retained the rural shrines, a bad mark. Where Kings has but a few verses on Asa, the chronicler gives him 3 whole chapters. As usual, the chronicler divides Asa's rule in 2. 35 good years doing what he is told, then 5 bad ones. In his happy decades, Asa defeats vast enemies from Ethiopia. The turning point in Asa's reign was a provocation by King Baasha of Israel. Baasha moved to establish a military garrison at the town of Ramah in the territory of Benjamin, a mere 8 kilometres north of Judah's capital of Jerusalem. Such a garrison would not only threaten the capital itself, but menace commercial traffic into the city. The 2 kingdoms had often skirmished in the territory of Benjamin, but this garrison was much more dangerous. At this point, a new and powerful actor enters the political stage and the biblical story. The kingdom of Aram Damascus, a potent player to Israel's northeast. In the final chapter that Kings devotes to Solomon, King Rezon of that kingdom appeared as a gadfly to the great king in his last years. To thwart Baasha of Israel, Asa played the best card he could. King Ben-Hadad I of Aram Damascus was a great friend of Baasha. Asa knew exactly how to turn that around. Quote, 1 Kings 15:18. So Asa took all the silver and gold that remained in the treasuries of the house of Yahweh, as well as the treasuries of the royal palace, and he entrusted them to his officials. King Asa sent them to King Ben-Hadad of Aram, who resided in Damascus, with this message: There is a pact between you and me, and between your father and my father. I herewith send you a gift of silver and gold. Go and break your pact with King Baasha of Israel, so that he may withdraw from me. Ben-Hadad responded to King Asa's request. He sent his army commanders against the towns of Israel. When Baasha heard about it, he stopped fortifying Ramah and remained in Tirzah. End quote. Ben-Hadad liked the look of Asa's silver and attacked Baasha's northern flank. Asa pushed north from Jerusalem and dismantled the fortifications at Ramah. When did this war take place? Obviously, it occurred sometime during the joint reigns of Asa of Judah, Baasha of Israel, and Ben-Hadad I of Damascus. But that only narrows it down to the 2 decades between 903 and 882 BC. That's the best we can say. The treasures of Jerusalem, the treasures accumulated by David and Solomon, had first been taken by Pharaoh Sheshonk during the time of Asa's grandfather, King Rehoboam. This was the second time that the temple was despoiled. It would be despoiled 3 more times before the final destruction of the kingdom of Judah. The biblical authors found nothing edifying in this scrap between the 2 kingdoms. The author of Kings, as usual, goes out of his way to condemn Israel and introduces Baasha's nemesis, Yahu. Quote, 1 Kings 16:1. The word of Yahweh came to Jehu against Baasha, saying, Since I exalted you out of the dust, and made you leader over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have caused my people Israel to sin, provoking me to anger with their sins, therefore I will consume Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam. Anyone belonging to Baasha who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat. And anyone of his who dies in the field, the birds of the air shall eat. End quote. Even the Judean hero of the story, Asa, gets a big whack over the head from the chronicler. Quote, 2 Chronicles 16:7. At that time Hanani the seer came to King Asa of Judah, and said to him, Because you relied on the king of Aram, and did not rely on Yahweh your God, therefore the army of the king of Aram has slipped out of your hands. For the eyes of Yahweh range over the entire earth, to give support to those who are wholeheartedly with him. You have acted foolishly in this matter, and henceforth you will be beset by wars. Asa was vexed at the seer, and put him into the stocks, for he was furious with him because of that. Asa inflicted cruelties on some of the people at that time. End quote. Asa has just saved Judah by bribing the king of Aram Damascus to attack his northern rival Israel. Then Hanani, some podunk prophet, appears from nowhere to complain that Asa should have attacked the very man who saved his kingdom. I understand Asa's response. That final verse about Asa inflicting cruelties is an odd but unexplained coda to the king's reign. In the next episode of The History in the Bible, I launch into the glory days of the Kingdom of Israel under the House of Omri. Thanks for listening.